I signed the papers that afternoon, and the lawyer said he would have the papers served to Sarah within the next few days. When Sarah received the divorce papers, she called me immediately, crying and asking why I hadn't tried to work things out before taking such a drastic step. I told her she had made her position clear when she chose to discuss our marriage problems with her friends instead of with me, and when she agreed with them that I wasn't good enough for her. Sarah said she never meant for things to go that far and had just been confused about what she wanted. But I told her the damage was already done. I said I couldn't be married to someone who saw me as settling for less than she deserved, and couldn't live in a house where I was constantly made to feel inadequate by her friends. She asked if we could go to counselling or try to work things out, but I told her the problems in our marriage weren't the kind counselling could fix. The issue wasn't communication or misunderstandings. She had fundamentally lost respect for me and allowed others to convince her our life together wasn't good enough. Sarah then said her friends had been trying to help her understand why she felt unhappy, and maybe they gave her bad advice, but that didn't mean our marriage had to end. I told her good friends would have encouraged her to talk to her husband about her feelings instead of encouraging her to imagine life with someone else. I explained her friends spent months making me feel unwelcome in my own home and undermining our relationship, and she had participated instead of stopping it. I said a marriage couldn't survive when one person allowed outsiders to attack and belittle their spouse, and I deserved better than what our relationship had become. The divorce process took about 8 months to complete because we had to divide shared assets and decide what to do with our house. Sarah ended up buying out my half with money her parents lent her, and I used my share of the equity as a down payment on a small condo closer to the school where I taught. During those 8 months, I had very little contact with Sarah except through lawyers, but mutual friends told me she was still spending time with her coffee club friends who were helping her through the divorce. Some of those friends said Sarah seemed relieved the marriage was ending, confirming I'd made the right decision. I also heard Rebecca comment that Sarah was better off without someone who couldn't appreciate her worth, and Jessica said Sarah would have no trouble finding someone more suitable when she was ready to date again. Those remarks didn't surprise me. I knew Sarah's friends were congratulating themselves for breaking up our marriage. I moved into my condo and began rebuilding my life as a single man. I was surprised by how much happier I felt away from the constant negativity and judgment that had overtaken my marriage. I realized I had spent months walking on eggshells, trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I wasn't good enough. It felt good to be in a place where I could just be myself. About 12 months after the divorce was final, I ran into Maria at the grocery store. She acted like an old friend we hadn't seen in a while. She asked how I was doing and said she hoped there were no hard feelings about everything that happened. She seemed genuinely surprised when I didn't respond enthusiastically. I told Maria I held her and her friends responsible for destroying my marriage and thought they were manipulative people who enjoyed creating problems in others' lives. She got defensive and said they were only trying to help Sarah figure out what would make her happy, and it wasn't their fault if our marriage had problems. I said our marriage had normal problems couples work through together, but her group turned those problems into reasons for Sarah to leave me for someone better. I told her they spent months making me feel unwelcome in my own home and convincing my wife she settled for less than she deserved, and their behavior had been cruel and destructive. Maria said Sarah was the one who came to them with complaints about our marriage and that they only listened and offered support like good friends should. I told her that good friends would have encouraged Sarah to communicate with her husband and work on their problems together, not encouraged her to imagine what life would be like with someone else. That conversation ended with Maria walking away in a huff, and I felt good about finally telling one of those women exactly what I thought of their behavior. I knew they probably got together later to call me bitter, but I didn't care because I was done trying to win their approval or prove I was good enough. About a year after our divorce, I heard through mutual friends that Sarah had started dating someone new. Her friends were very excited about him because he was a successful businessman who could give her the kind of lifestyle they thought she deserved. I felt a little sad hearing the news, but I also learned that Sarah's new boyfriend didn't particularly like her friends and thought they were too involved in her personal life. That made me smile because I knew Sarah would eventually have to choose between keeping her friends happy and maintaining a healthy relationship. I hoped for her sake she would make a better choice the second time around. In the end, Sarah's friends were right about one thing. We weren't in the same league, but they were wrong about which one of us was settling for less than we deserved. Finally, I asked Sarah if this was how she felt too, and if she agreed with what her friends were saying about our marriage. She looked up at me and said she didn't know how to answer that, but had been thinking a lot about whether we wanted the same things out of life. Rebecca then said Sarah had been confiding in them about how trapped she felt in a marriage where she couldn't grow or experience the things she wanted to experience. She said Sarah was too kind to hurt my feelings by saying it directly, but had told them she sometimes felt like she settled for less than what she truly wanted when she married me. I felt like I'd been punched. I looked at Sarah and asked if she had really said those things to her friends. Sarah started crying and said she'd been confused and frustrated, saying things she probably shouldn't have. Her feelings were complicated, and she didn't know how to sort them out. Jessica then said Sarah deserved to be with someone intellectually in her league, and that it wasn't fair for either of us to stay in a marriage where one person felt like they were settling. She said Sarah was an educated woman with so much potential and needed a partner who could challenge her and provide growth opportunities, not someone content with a simple life. That phrase, in her league, hit me like a slap across the face. I realized that's what all those months of comments and conversations had been leading to. Sarah's friends had convinced her she was too good for me and that I was holding her back from a better life she deserved with a more successful man. I asked Sarah directly if she thought I was below her league and if that was how she really saw our marriage. The room went completely silent. Everyone looked at Sarah, waiting for her answer. I could see her struggling. Finally, she looked at me and said she didn't think in terms of leagues, but sometimes felt we were at different places in life and maybe wanted different futures. She said her friends helped her realize it was okay to want more, and that maybe we'd both changed since marriage in ways that made us less compatible. Rebecca nodded and said it wasn't anyone's fault when two people grew apart, but it was important to be honest when a relationship had run its course. She said Sarah was young enough to start over with someone who could give her the life she wanted, and that I deserved someone who appreciated me for who I was, instead of wishing I were different. I stood there listening as these women discussed my marriage like it was a failing business. I realized Sarah had already made her decision. She had chosen her friends' opinions over our relationship and let them convince her I was a burden or obstacle to her happiness. I told everyone I'd heard enough. I didn't need a group of women telling me I wasn't good enough for my own wife in my living room. I said if Sarah felt she settled for less than she deserved when she married me, then maybe we needed a serious conversation about what that meant for our future. Sarah's friends exchanged satisfied looks, as if they'd achieved their goal. Rebecca said sometimes the truth was hard to hear, but better than living in denial. Jessica added they were just trying to help Sarah figure out what would make her truly happy, and Maria said they cared about Sarah too much to watch her waste her life unfulfilled. I looked at Sarah once more and asked if she wanted me to leave so she could keep discussing our marriage with her friends, or if she wanted them to leave so we could talk privately. Sarah looked back and forth between me and her friends, then said, "Maybe it was better if I gave her some time to think." That was the moment I knew our marriage was over. She chose to ask me to leave rather than tell her friends to mind their own business. I went upstairs and packed a bag with a few days' clothes. I could hear the women downstairs whispering about what had happened. When I came back downstairs with my bag, Sarah stood in the hallway, looking confused and upset. I told her I was going to stay at my brother's house for a while so she could have the time she needed to think about what she wanted, and that when she was ready to talk, we could figure out what came next. Sarah started to say something, but I raised my hand and told her I didn't want to hear any more about how I wasn't good enough or how she felt trapped in our marriage. I said if she really believed what her friends had been telling her, then we both deserve better than trying to make a relationship work when one person thought the other was beneath them. I walked past the living room where her friends were, still sitting, and I could see them watching everything with interest, like they were enjoying the drama they had created. Rebecca called out, saying she hoped I understood they were just trying to help. I stopped, turned around, and told her that destroying someone's marriage wasn't helping anyone. I told all of them that they had spent months coming into my home, making me feel unwelcome and inadequate, and that they had turned my wife against me by convincing her she deserved better than what we had built together. I said they were the kind of people who couldn't be happy unless they made others feel bad about their lives, and I felt sorry for their husbands, who had to live with women never satisfied with what they had. Linda started to say something, but I was already walking toward the door. I told them they had gotten what they wanted and could all pat themselves on the back for breaking up a marriage. I said I hoped Sarah's new life with someone more worthy of her would make them all feel better about their own problems. I left the house and drove to my brother Tom's apartment. I spent the next 3 days trying to process what happened and figure out what I wanted to do next. Tom was angry when I told him the whole story. He said Sarah's friends sounded like toxic, people who enjoyed creating drama in other people's lives. He said he never liked how Sarah changed after she started hanging out with those women, and noticed at family gatherings how embarrassed she seemed by our modest lifestyle compared to her friends. He said a good wife would have defended her husband instead of letting her friends attack him, and that Sarah showed her true character by choosing their opinions over our marriage. I called Sarah several times during those 3 days, but she didn't answer. When I finally reached her, she said she needed more time to think and wasn't ready to talk yet. I asked if her friends were still coming over and giving her advice about our marriage. She got defensive and said she needed to talk to people who cared about her happiness. That conversation made it clear Sarah wasn't planning to fight for our marriage or tell her friends to stay out of our business. She was going to let them keep influencing her decisions about our future. I realized even if we worked things out temporarily, this same situation would keep happening as long as she valued her friends' opinions more than our relationship. Spent the next week thinking about all the good times Sarah and I shared during our 8 years together and trying to figure out if there was any way to save our marriage. I thought about the woman I fell in love with in college who supported my dream of becoming a teacher, and wondered when she started seeing my career as something to be ashamed of instead of proud of. But every time I considered trying to work things out, I remembered how Sarah sat silently while her friends told me I wasn't good enough for her, and how she asked me to leave instead of asking them to leave. I realized the woman I married was gone, and the person she became under her friends' influence wasn't someone I could build a life with. I made an appointment with a divorce lawyer recommended by a colleague at school and spent 2 hours telling him everything that happened over the past several months. The lawyer said what I described sounded like emotional abuse, and that Sarah's friends had essentially conducted a campaign to undermine my marriage and self-esteem. He explained that while we didn't have children or significant assets to divide, I would still need to go through the legal process of filing for divorce and serving Sarah with papers. Based on what I told him, he said it sounded like Sarah might not contest the divorce since she already expressed feeling unfulfilled in our marriage. I stood there listening to my wife and her friends talk about me like I was some kind of charity case or burden. And something inside me broke. Something I don't think ever fully healed. Sarah looked at me again, and I could see in her eyes she meant everything she said. She was saying these things, and that she had probably been thinking about them for a long time without telling me. I set my sandwich down on the coffee table and said I needed to run some errands. Without saying goodbye, I left the house. I drove around for 2 hours, thinking about everything that had happened, trying to figure out when my wife had stopped respecting me and started seeing me as someone she was embarrassed by. When I got home that evening, Sarah's friends were gone, and she was in the kitchen making dinner as if nothing had happened. I asked if we could talk, and she said sure. I told her I'd heard what she said about wondering what her life would be like with someone else, and how she felt limited being married to me. Sarah immediately got defensive and said I was taking things out of context, that she was just having a conversation with her friends. She said women often talk about hypothetical situations, and that it didn't mean anything, but I could tell by the way she avoided looking at me that she knew she'd crossed a line. I told her it wasn't just about what she said that day, but how she had been treating me for months in front of her friends, never defending me when they made those little comments about my job or our lifestyle. I said I felt like she was ashamed of me and would rather be married to someone like Rebecca's or Jessica's husband, someone who could buy her expensive things and take her to fancy events. Sarah started crying and said that wasn't true, but then admitted she sometimes felt frustrated that we couldn't do the things her friends did with their husbands. She said she felt left out when they talked about vacations, shopping trips, and fancy dinners, wishing we had more money to experience those things too. I told her I understood she wanted nice things and experiences, but the way she was handling her feelings was destroying our marriage. I said her friends were using her insecurities to make themselves feel better, and that she was letting them turn her against me instead of talking directly to me about what she wanted. Sarah said her friends were just successful women who understood what it meant to have high standards, and maybe I should be more motivated to improve our situation instead of being satisfied with where we were. She said all her friends' husbands had worked hard to get where they were, and maybe I needed to push myself more instead of just accepting that teaching was all I would ever do. That conversation went on for hours, getting more heated as we both said things we couldn't take back. Sarah kept defending her friends, saying they were just trying to encourage her to want more out of life. I kept trying to explain they were actually encouraging her to want less of me. The next few weeks were tense and awkward as we both pretended everything was normal. But I could feel Sarah pulling away more and more. She started spending even more time with her friends and came home with stories about their husband's latest achievements and purchases, telling these stories in a way that clearly compared their lives to ours. The Tuesday coffee club meetings continued, and I started staying late at school or going to the gym to avoid being home when her friends came over. But sometimes I would come home while they were still there, and I'd hear them talking about me in the kitchen or living room. They made comments about how I seemed stressed or tired and suggested maybe Sarah needed to find ways to motivate me to be more successful. One evening in April, I came home from a faculty meeting to find Sarah sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of real estate flyers and brochures for expensive cars and vacation destinations. She said Linda had given her some information about different ways we could improve our lifestyle and wanted to talk about making changes to our financial situation. I looked through the materials and realized everything she showed me required spending money we didn't have or taking on debt we couldn't afford on my teacher's salary. Sarah said maybe it was time for me to look into other career options that paid better or get a second job so we could start living more like her friends. I told her I loved teaching and that I was good at it. I didn't want to leave a job where I felt I was making a difference just so we could buy expensive things to impress her friends. I said that if she wanted more money, maybe she should look into getting a job herself instead of spending her days shopping and having coffee with women who spent their time making others feel bad about their lives. Sarah got angry and said her friends' husbands didn't expect their wives to work because they made enough money to support their families comfortably. She said it wasn't fair for me to expect her to get a job when I was the one who couldn't provide the kind of lifestyle that successful couples had. Maybe the problem was that I lacked ambition rather than her having unrealistic expectations. That fight lasted until almost midnight, and by the end, we were both saying things we knew would hurt each other as much as possible. Sarah said she was tired of feeling embarrassed when her friends talked about their lives because she had nothing comparable to share. I said I was tired of feeling like a disappointment in my own home because I couldn't compete with men who had completely different careers and priorities. The next morning, we barely spoke, and I could tell something fundamental had changed between us. Sarah seemed like she had made up her mind about something and acted as if she was just waiting for the right moment to say whatever she was thinking. That moment came the following Tuesday when I came home early from school because one of my students had been in a car accident and I was too upset to finish my afternoon classes. I walked into our house and found the coffee club in session as usual, but this time they stopped talking when they saw me come in. I could tell they'd been discussing something serious. I said hello and started to go upstairs, but Rebecca called out and asked me to come back because they wanted to talk to me about something. From the tone of her voice, I knew whatever they wanted to say wasn't going to be good. I came back to the living room and stood near the doorway. Rebecca looked at the other women, then at me, and said they'd all been talking about Sarah's situation and were concerned about her happiness. She said Sarah was such a wonderful woman who deserved a partner who could match her intelligence and potential, and they felt she was being held back from reaching her full potential. Jessica jumped in, saying they'd all noticed how unhappy Sarah seemed lately, and that it was obvious she was struggling with feeling unfulfilled in her marriage. She said Sarah was too loyal and kind to say anything directly, but it was clear to everyone who knew her that she needed more from a relationship than what she was getting. Maria said they'd been encouraging Sarah to think seriously about what she wanted from life, and maybe it was time for her to consider whether she was with the right person for her future goals and dreams. She said sometimes people grow in different directions, and it wasn't anyone's fault, but it was important to be honest when a relationship wasn't working anymore. Linda nodded and said Sarah was still young, beautiful, and intelligent, and shouldn't waste her best years with someone who couldn't give her the life she deserved. She said Sarah's friends wanted what was best for her, and sometimes that meant making difficult decisions about relationships that weren't benefiting both people. I looked at Sarah during this whole speech. She was sitting on our couch looking down at her hands and didn't say anything to defend me or tell her friends they were out of line for talking to me like this in my own home. I waited for her to speak up and tell them to stop, but she just sat there silently while her friends told me I wasn't good enough for my own wife. Wife's friends spent months coming to our house, telling her she deserved better than me. When they finally said I wasn't in her league, right to my face, she just sat there and didn't defend me. So I walked out and left her. I never thought my marriage would end the way it did, but now, while writing this, I can see all the signs that led to that final moment when I packed my bags and walked out the door. My name is David, and I was married to Sarah for 8 years, before everything fell apart. The worst part is that it all happened right in front of her friends, whom she cared more about impressing than protecting her own husband. Sarah and I met in college, and back then, she seemed different from the person she later became. She was kind and supportive, and we shared the same dreams about building a life together. But somewhere along the way, after we got married and bought our house in the suburbs, she started hanging out with a group of women from our neighborhood who changed her completely. These women were all married to men who made a lot more money than I did. They spent their days shopping, going to expensive lunches, and talking about their husbands' jobs, how much they spent on vacations, cars, and jewelry. Sarah started comparing our life to theirs and began acting like she was embarrassed by me and my job as a high school teacher. Even though when we first got married, she said she admired how I wanted to help kids learn and grow. The group of women included Rebecca, married to a lawyer, Jessica, whose husband owned a restaurant, Maria, whose husband was a doctor, and Linda, whose husband worked in real estate and made huge commissions selling expensive houses. They would come to our house every Tuesday for what they called their coffee club, but it was really just an excuse for them to gossip, show off, and make each other feel bad about their lives. At first, Sarah tried to keep me away from these meetings. She would ask me to stay late at school or run errands when her friends came over. But I started noticing she was different after they left. She would be quiet and moody, making comments about how we needed to get a bigger house or how I should look for a better paying job. When I asked her what was wrong, she would just say nothing and go to bed early. The first time I really understood what was happening was about 6 months ago when I came home early from school because I had a migraine and needed to lie down. I walked into our living room and found all 5 women sitting around our coffee table with their expensive purses and designer clothes. They were talking about their husbands, how much money they made, and what kind of cars they drove. Sarah saw me come in and her face went red. She introduced me to her friends, even though I had met most of them before at neighborhood parties. Rebecca looked me up and down and said hello in a way that made it clear she thought I was interrupting something important. Jessica just nodded without really looking at me. I said hello to everyone and went to the kitchen to get some water for my headache, but I could hear them talking in low voices. I caught Sarah saying something about how I was having a rough day at work. When I came back through the living room to go upstairs, Maria made a comment about how it must be nice to have summers off like teachers do. She said it in a way that made it sound like I was lazy or that my job was easy. I wanted to explain that teachers don't actually get summers off because we spend that time planning lessons, taking professional development courses, and many of us work second jobs to make ends meet. But Sarah jumped in quickly and changed the subject to talk about some new restaurant Jessica's husband had bought. I went upstairs, took some medicine, and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about the way those women looked at me and how Sarah seemed embarrassed to have me there. After that day, things got worse because Sarah started inviting her friends over more often, and she stopped trying to schedule their meetings when I wasn't home. It was like she wanted me to be there, so they could all see how much better their husbands were than me. She seemed to enjoy the way they talked down to me or ignored me completely when I walked through my own living room. The comments started small but grew worse over time. Rebecca would make jokes about how teachers probably don't understand business or money. Jessica would talk about how her husband bought her expensive jewelry, and then they'd look at Sarah's wedding ring, which was modest because that's all we could afford when I proposed. Maria would mention how her husband worked long hours to support their family, as if implying I didn't work hard enough. Linda talked about their lavish vacations and how important it was to enjoy the finer things in life. Sarah never defended me during these talks. Sometimes, she even joined in with remarks about how we needed to be more ambitious, or how she wished we could afford to do more. She started saying how her friends' husbands were so successful and driven, sighing when she looked around our house, which was perfectly nice but not as big or fancy as theirs. The worst part was, these women made those comments right in front of me, as if I wasn't even there, or my feelings didn't matter. They'd brag about their husbands' promotions and bonuses while staring at me like I was some kind of failure. And Sarah would just nod along, agreeing with everything they said. I tried talking to Sarah about how her friends made me feel unwelcome in my own home, but she got defensive, saying I was too sensitive, or didn't understand how women talk to each other. She insisted her friends were just sharing their lives, and that I shouldn't take things so personally. But I knew there was more to it because I saw the way they exchanged looks when they made those little remarks. One day in March, the situation hit a breaking point I still think about every day. I came home early from school again because we had a half day for teacher conferences. The coffee club was in full swing in our living room. They were discussing some charity gala they were all attending with their husbands, describing the expensive dresses they bought and the donations their husbands made to impress others at the event. I said hello and went to the kitchen to make myself a sandwich since I hadn't eaten lunch. I could hear them talking about me in the next room. Rebecca said something about how it was too bad not everyone could afford to attend events like that, and Jessica laughed, commenting that some people have different priorities in life. When I came back through the living room with my sandwich, Maria looked at me and said, "It must be nice to have such a simple life, without all the stress and responsibility that comes with a high-powered career." She smiled, but her voice had a sharp edge. Linda nodded and added that some people are just meant for different kinds of work. My face flushed, and I wanted to respond, but before I could say anything, Sarah laughed and said she sometimes wondered what it would be like to be married to someone more ambitious. She spoke like she was joking, but everyone could tell she was serious. Her friends exchanged knowing smiles. Rebecca said Sarah was smart and beautiful and could probably have married anyone she wanted. She asked if Sarah ever thought about how her life would be different if she'd made other choices. The room fell, silent as everyone looked at Sarah, waiting for her answer. I stood there holding my sandwich, wanting to disappear. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then back at her friends, and said she tried not to think about things like that, because it wasn't fair to compare. But then she admitted she sometimes wondered what it would be like to be with someone who could offer more opportunities and experiences. She said she loved me, but sometimes felt limited in what we could do together. Her friends all nodded, as if they completely understood. Jessica said it was important for women to have partners who match their ambition and sophistication. She added that some people are naturally more driven than others. Maria said it's hard to grow when you're with someone content with mediocrity. Linda said life's too short to settle for less than what you really want.